In Ireland in the 1990s, fear is spreading. Young women, most of them in their early 20s, are disappearing in the area around the capital Dublin.
Distraught, anguished and bewildered, the parents of Deirdre Jacob once again today pleaded for help in finding their daughter as the 15th anniversary of her disappearance approaches.
We know something sinister happened to her that night.
Josephine Dollard is now 6 days missing. From early morning, Gardaí were active throughout 3 counties.
The cases usually begin as seemingly harmless missing person reports. The police are certain that the women will turn up again soon. But as time passes, it becomes clear in some of the missing persons cases that the women did not voluntarily walk away from their old lives. There appear to be connections between some of the cases. Investigators recognize patterns and have to admit that they are probably dealing with crimes after all. The cases of the missing women cause horror and raise disturbing questions in Irish society. Is a serial killer on the loose? The so-called Vanishing Triangle lies in the triangle formed by the counties of Dublin, Kildare, and Wicklow. It is a term coined by the Irish media for a large area in which a number of women disappeared between 1979 and 1998. Authorities suspect that 3, possibly 6, of the missing cases are related and belong to the Vanishing Triangle complex. The number of unreported cases could be even higher. It is impossible to say for sure, as the cases are not only unsolved, but in most of them, the women's remains have not even been found. The young women all disappeared while going about their normal daily business outside their homes. Some of the missing women were even last seen immediately before or near their homes. We can only speculate about a connection, but that is exactly what we will do today. We will look at some of the cases from the Vanishing Triangle and see if there are any possible links that could point to a serial killer. To do so, we first return to Ireland in the 1990s. It all begins in March 1993.
There isn't a real thing called a vanishing triangle into which women step and some of them will disappear and vanish without trace. But what is very real is that women vanished without trace and their bodies have never been found.
Annie McCarrick is 26 years old. The American originally comes from New York. She has now moved to Dublin to study. She lives with 2 roommates in a shared apartment in Sandymount, a rather quiet neighborhood. Annie's family is originally from Dublin, so the 26-year-old is enthusiastic about exploring her family's Irish homeland. Annie's mother is planning to visit at the end of March 1993. She wants to fly from New York to Dublin, especially to see her daughter for a few days and do some sightseeing. Unfortunately, this carefree visit will never happen. On March 26, 1993, Annie is expected at work to pick up her paycheck, but the young woman does not show up. She also fails to show up for a date with friends the following day, March 27, 1993. Annie's friends are worried and contact the 26-year-old's parents. The McCarricks don't hesitate for a second and immediately board a plane to Dublin. Annie is reported missing on March 28th. Annie's parents contact the Irish police and the American embassy in the hope of finding the young woman quickly. But Annie McCarrick remains missing. On March 26th, Annie told her roommates that she was going for a short walk. She never returns from that walk. The police initially suspect that Annie has simply gone on an exploratory tour of Ireland. After all, she wanted to get to know her family's homeland better, so perhaps the 26-year-old was simply looking for adventure. But Annie's family doesn't believe that. They organize their own search parties. A week after Annie's disappearance, the police finally set up an investigation team. At the same time, the McCarrick family hired a private detective. Soon, there were some initial findings in the missing person case. Annie was seen on the morning of March 26th. However, she did not show up for work as agreed in the late afternoon. So, something must have happened to her during the day. On the morning of her disappearance, Annie ran some errands and went to a bank branch and a supermarket in Dublin. A witness believes he saw Annie later that day on a bus on Route 44. The bus runs between Dublin and the small town of Enniskerry, which Annie often visited. In line with this, a witness claims to have seen the young woman in a pub in Enniskerry at around 9 p.m. Annie was reportedly at Johnny Fox's, about 3 miles from the town center. The owner of Johnny Fox's confirms this statement and says that an unknown man paid her bill. Since this sighting in a pub in Enniskerry coincides with the bus trip to the town, the police initially consider this lead to be credible. And that is precisely what may prove to be a fatal mistake, as it turns out later. The pub owner only made his statement after being shown a photo of Annie. It is possible that the situation unfolded as he described it, and that he saw a woman who looked very similar to Annie McCarrick. However, the sighting is not as clear-cut as initially assumed. Based on the witness statement, the police publish a sketch of the man. This sketch becomes the focus of the investigation, and the hopes of the entire investigation team depend on this drawing. But after a few weeks, it becomes clear that the lead is going nowhere. No one comes forward. The other visitors to the pub are also unable to provide any information about Annie or the man in the sketch. Apart from this one statement, there is no further evidence that Annie was ever at the Johnny Fox pub.
I don't think she was at Johnny Fox's that night. She was very chatty. She really liked to have conversations and meet people. Between her beauty and just how kind she was, and she was an American, there would have definitely been more than just a doorman remembering her.
Today, it is being considered that Annie McCarrick never visited the pub on the day of her disappearance. Another witness comes forward sometime later. She claims to have seen Annie on March 26th in Enniskerry in a bar called Poppy's Cafe, where the witness works as a waitress. Annie arrived at the cafe in the afternoon and was accompanied by a man. She remembers the woman very well because she appeared to be American. She was also the last customer she served during her shift. However, the waitress is the only person who can place Annie at Poppy's Cafe. This means that the only evidence linking Annie to the pub and the cafe comes from one person. After Annie's disappearance, a friend tells the McCarricks that the 26-year-old had been having some problems recently. She had been repeatedly harassed by an acquaintance. Annie had last seen this man a week before her disappearance. Another friend tells her parents that Annie was once beaten by an acquaintance when he was drunk. These two statements from friends are forwarded to the Irish police via fax by the family. However, the Irish police never responded to these messages. Meanwhile, investigators claim they never received the fax messages. It is unclear whether there was a communication misunderstanding. The fact is that the police never investigated in this direction, and Annie McCarrick remains missing to this day. Her case is considered the starting point for one of the greatest mysteries in Irish criminal history, the Vanishing Triangle. Jojo Dullard is out with friends in Dublin on November 9th, 1995. It has been almost 2.5 years since Annie McCarrick disappeared. Jojo is 21 years old and actually lives in Callan. However, on November 9th, 1995, she misses the last bus back there. This leaves 21-year-old Jojo stranded in Dublin in the evening. It is unclear why exactly Jojo leaves her group of friends in Dublin that evening. She apparently tries to hitchhike her way back home. This leads her to the village of Moon later that evening. From there, Jojo calls her friend Mary from a phone booth at around 11:15 p.m. Jojo says she is hitchhiking home and will call again as soon as she arrives. Shortly before the call ends, Jojo quickly tells Mary that a car has just stopped next to her. Then the connection is lost, and Jojo Dullard disappears. Forever. A witness claims to have seen Jojo later that night in Castledermot. Another person believes they saw Jojo next to a dark Toyota Carina. However, these sightings can never be verified. there is no concrete trace of the 21-year-old in either Castledermot or Moon. Jojo never arrives home that evening. The police suspect that the person who picked her up in Moon did something to her. Just like Annie McCarrick, Jojo disappears without a trace. But even more than 25 years later, the case of missing Jojo Dullard is still under investigation. It is not until the end of 2020 that her case is reclassified from a missing person case to a murder case.
We are satisfied as a result of our inquiries and those of the Serious Crime Review team that Josephine Dullard came to harm on the night in question in Moon, and we are reclassifying this investigation to that of murder.
Jojo's parents have since passed away. They never found out what happened to their 21-year-old daughter in 1995. Jojo's sister and other relatives are still searching for her, even after more than 2 decades. The third disappearance in the so-called Vanishing Triangle is the case of Deirdre Jacob. She was last seen in 1998, 5 years after Annie and 3 years after Jojo.
Deirdre's disappearance has had huge impact on our lives. Everywhere we go, we're looking through people. We're just wondering, would Deirdre turn up that way? Every time we drive out to the gateway, as we're going out onto the road, it will cross our minds. We may not say it to each other, but it's on our minds. Well, this is where Deirdre was last sighted.
Deirdre Jacob is 18 years old at the time. She wants to become a primary school teacher. As part of her training, she does an internship in 1998 at Newbridge Primary School, which she herself attended as a child. The school is located in Kildare, about an hour's drive from Dublin. Deirdre Jacob spends most of her time in London, where she attends college. In the summer of 1998, however, she was visiting her parents in Newbridge for a while because of her internship. On July 28, 1998, she set off for the town center. She wanted to go to the bank and run a few errands. At 2:14 p.m., she was filmed by a surveillance camera on her way down Newbridge's main street. At 2:18 p.m., Deirdre enters an AIB bank branch and has a check for £100 written out. A few moments later, she leaves the bank. At 2:26 p.m., the 18-year-old is filmed again by a surveillance camera, this time at the Newbridge post office. She wants to send the bank check she just picked up to her roommate in London for rent. The whole thing takes only a few minutes. She leaves the post office and meets a friend in front of it. At 2:32 p.m., the two are caught on camera in front of the post office. They talk briefly before going their separate ways. Deirdre walks back down Newbridge's main street alone. At 2:35 p.m., she is filmed once again by a surveillance camera at a PTSB bank branch. She is last seen shortly after 3 p.m. near her parents' home in Newbridge. After that, she disappears forever. After Deirdre's disappearance, the Irish criminal authorities launch Operation Trace. Trace is tasked with investigating possible links between Deirdre's disappearance and the 2 previous missing persons and murder cases in the Vanishing Triangle area. Other cases from within the Vanishing Triangle are also being investigated. We'll get to that in a moment. And before anyone says that a triangle doesn't have a radius, yes, I know. Unfortunately, as with Annie and Jojo, neither Deirdre's remains nor any decisive clues are found. In 2021, Irish police search a wooded area in Kilding. There were reports of suspicious activity there on the evening of Deirdre's disappearance.
The woodland we're at here today was identified as an area of interest that may be relevant to the investigation. For that purpose, today we've commenced a search of that woodland on foot of a search warrant that we've obtained from the district court.
Unfortunately, the search of the forest area has been unsuccessful. There are no new findings in the Deirdre Jacob case, but there is still movement in the case, even more than 2 decades after Deirdre's disappearance. In connection with the new investigations, the media is also increasingly picking up on the 2 other cases. The police have not commented specifically on a possible connection between the cases of Deirdre Jacob, Jojo Dullard, and Annie McCarrick. However, there are some sources that suggest that the police suspect that these 3 cases are linked. Not only that, but other cases from the Vanishing Triangle are also being discussed in the media again. There are 3 other cases from the Vanishing Triangle that are often mentioned in the same breath as the 3 presented so far. However, a common perpetrator seems less likely here. For the sake of completeness, I would nevertheless like to present these 3 cases here. Not only did these 3 women also disappear in the Vanishing Triangle, but their cases remain unsolved to this day. Later, a theory emerged that the alleged series of murders in the Vanishing Triangle began much earlier. Namely, not in 1993 with the disappearance of Annie McCarrick, but possibly as early as the late 1970s. Specifically, this concerns the murder case of Phyllis Murphy. Phyllis's case is the only one of the missing cases presented here that is considered solved. It is the only case in which a body has been found. Phyllis worked in a factory in Newbridge in the late 1970s. This is the town where, almost 20 years later, 18-year-old Deidre Jacobs disappeared. Phyllis really liked her job at the factory, but dreamed of becoming a pediatric nurse one day. On the evening of December 22, 1979, Phyllis waited for the bus but never got on. The police concluded that Phyllis must have gotten into a car that evening. Someone probably offered her a ride. However, Phyllis's relatives are certain that she would never have gotten into a car like that. Accordingly, the police are considering the possibility that someone from her personal circle is responsible for Phyllis Murphy's disappearance. About a month after her disappearance, Phyllis Murphy's body is found. Before her death, the young woman was severely physically abused. Investigators suspect that Phyllis Murphy was murdered shortly after her disappearance. Due to the cold weather conditions, the body is still well enough preserved to draw some conclusions about the crime. Phyllis's body has more than 25 hematomas, probably caused by powerful blows. In addition, Phyllis was sexually abused. Traces of semen were found on her body. The outpouring of sympathy after Phyllis's body was found was enormous. More than 2,000 people attended the public funeral service for the young woman. Unfortunately, the Phyllis Murphy case remained unsolved for a long time. The young woman's family and friends lived in uncertainty. Until 1998, when new investigations into the missing persons in the Vanishing Triangle were launched. Because Phyllis came from the same town as Deidre Jacob, who was also missing, her case was reopened. Phyllis was killed in 1979, 14 years before Annie McCarrick, the first woman I told you about today. Nevertheless, the investigation team does not rule out the possibility that the perpetrators could be the same person.
Deidre Jacob went missing in Newbridge. Jojo Dullard went missing in Moon. Phyllis Murphy went missing in Newbridge. The 3 of those locations were in Kildare, which is remarkable.
2 decades after Phyllis's murder, a new lead has suddenly emerged. Thanks to advances in DNA technology, the semen traces found on Phyllis's body can be traced back to someone. A man named John Crerar, whose daughter Kildale is still alive. The investigators believe they have a match. But there is one crucial problem. John Crerar has an alibi for the night Phyllis Murphy disappeared. He was at work. However, a review of the evidence reveals that John Crerar was temporarily absent during his shift. He knows Phyllis and her family personally and thus fits the profile of the perpetrator. John Crerar is eventually charged with the murder of Phyllis Murphy and sentenced to life imprisonment. And it is striking that after John Crerar is arrested in 1999, the missing cases in the Vanishing Triangle abruptly stop.
On the face of it, Crerar would have to be a serious suspect. He wasn't 100 miles away from what we had thought may have happened to our missing women. Having said that, despite all the investigations that were done and all the background checks and everything else, we didn't acquire any evidence to connect Crerar.
Of course, John Crerar's conviction is a huge success for the investigators. After more than 2 decades, the murder of Phyllis Murphy has finally been solved. However, hopes that John Crerar may be responsible for other cases from the Vanishing Triangle soon fade. No connection can be established between the missing cases of Annie McCarrick, Jojo Dullard, or Deirdre Jacob. The investigators have no choice but to continue their search and look into other missing persons cases from the Vanishing Triangle. The case of Imelda Keenan is often mentioned in connection with the Vanishing Triangle. The 22-year-old student disappears one day in January 1994. Imelda lives with her fiancé, Mark Wall, on William Street in Waterford City. Mark later reports that Imelda left at around 1 p.m. on January 3rd to go to the post office. She left her handbag and glasses in the apartment. The post office is still closed on January 3rd due to the holidays. At around 1:30 p.m., a witness believes he saw Imelda at an intersection on Lombard Street. After that, the 22-year-old's trail goes cold. Investigators believe she took her own life.
Imelda would never, ever think of suicide. I don't think Imelda would ever consider that.
Conversely, this could mean that some steps vital to a murder investigation were overlooked during the investigation. In the early 2000s, the Imelda Keenan case was also investigated as a Vanishing Triangle case. However, investigators found no direct link to the other cases. Today, the case is still classified as a missing person case, not a murder case. Unlike the cases of Annie, Jojo, and Deirdre, it is considered unlikely that the Imelda Keenan case is related to these 3 cases. However, there are 3 other cases that occurred in the Vanishing Triangle and remain unsolved to this day. One of the cases is the disappearance of Fiona Pender. Fiona is 25 years old in 1996. The young woman worked not only as a hairstylist, but also as a model. She was also expecting her first child and was 7 months pregnant. On August 22, 1996, Fiona was out with her mother in Tullamore. The two were shopping together. The small town is located about 100 kilometers from the Irish capital, Dublin. At around 7 p.m., Fiona said goodbye to her mother and disappeared forever. A year after Fiona Pender's disappearance, her boyfriend at the time, John Thompson, was arrested. John's father and sister were also arrested. All 3 are questioned extensively about Fiona's disappearance. John claims that he saw Fiona at home at around 6 a.m. on August 23rd when he left for work. According to this, Fiona must have come home on the evening of August 22nd. According to individual media reports, John is said to have a tendency towards sexual violence. However, there is clearly no evidence that he was involved in the disappearance of his partner, Fiona Pender. He, his father, and his sister are released. John Thompson has an alibi for the time of Fiona's disappearance. As a result, the expectant mother is still considered one of the women who disappeared in the Vanishing Triangle. Another missing person case in this area is that of Ciara Breen from Dundalk. The town is located an hour's drive north of Dublin, near the border with Northern Ireland. When she disappears, Ciara Breen is just days away from her 18th birthday. Throughout her teenage years, she repeatedly sneaks out of the house at night. For her mother, this was naturally more than worrying, but also a sad habit. Nevertheless, Ciara always returned home, until the night of August 12th to 13th, 1997. When Ciara's mother woke up around 1 a.m., she looked into her daughter's room. Ciara was not in her bed, and her window was wide open. the police pursue the theory that Ciara sneaked out of her parents' house on her own to meet an older man that night. 20 years after her disappearance, a suspect is arrested in 2017. His name is Liam Mullen, but he can no longer be questioned. Before the police can question him, Liam Mullen takes his own life. No one ever finds out what happened to Ciara, and her remains are never found. The third of the probably unrelated cases from the Vanishing Triangle is the disappearance of Fiona Sinnert. In 1998, Fiona is 19 years old. Despite her young age, Fiona has had an eventful life. At the age of 15, she left her parents' home to live with her partner Sean Carroll, who was 10 years older than her. Medical records show that Fiona had to visit the hospital several times after that because of domestic violence she suffered at the hands of Sean. In early 1998, however, 19-year-old Fiona managed to escape from this relationship. She left Sean Carroll together with her 11-month-old baby. At the age of only 19, she was now not only a survivor of domestic violence, but also a single mother. Fiona moved with her baby to Rosslare Harbour, hoping to find peace there. On February 8, 1998, Fiona had a rare evening to herself. Someone else takes care of the children for her, and the 19-year-old looks forward to a carefree evening. She visits a pub in Broadway, not far from her new home. And there, of all places, she meets her ex-boyfriend Sean that evening. It is the evening Fiona will disappear. Sean later states that he and Fiona got along very well that evening and had grown closer again. Fiona asked Sean to take her home because she wasn't feeling well. She went to bed and he slept on Fiona's couch. The next morning, February 9th, 1998, Sean's mother picked up the 30-year-old from his ex-girlfriend Fiona's apartment. According to Sean and his mother, Fiona was still feeling unwell that morning. The 19-year-old said she wanted to go to the doctor later, but declined Sean's mother's offer to drive her there. Fiona would not see a doctor that day. In fact, the 19-year-old is never seen again. There was reportedly a suspect during the investigation, but never enough evidence to arrest him for a crime. In the cases of Fiona Sinnert, Fiona Pender, Ciara Breen, and Imelda Keenan, there are separate suspects in each investigation. The identities of the suspects are not known in all cases, but all are believed to have had a personal relationship with the missing persons. Accordingly, a connection between these four cases is rather unlikely. However, the first three cases we discussed today, those of Annie McCarrick, Jojo Dullard, and Deirdre Jacob, appear to be more clearly linked. The theory of a serial perpetrator remains valid for these three cases. There is even a common suspect. In February 2000, a young woman is attacked in Carlow. She's about to get into her car when a stranger suddenly punches her in the face. The man forces her into his car and drives her to a remote forest. The forest is only 2.5 miles from his home. In the woods, the perpetrator abuses the young woman, then tries to strangle her and suffocate her with a plastic bag. But the murder attempt fails. The young woman survives with serious injuries. It is only by chance that two hunters are in the woods and are able to stop the perpetrator. Thanks to the courage of the two hunters, he is arrested by the police. The perpetrator is named Larry Murphy, who is married and the father of 2 young children. He is described as antisocial and a loner. He says that the attack on the young woman in February 2000 was a one-time impulse. Larry Murphy is arrested and immediately becomes a person of interest in other cases in the Vanishing Triangle. He often travels to Kildare and North Wicklow for work, and the modus operandi surrounding the attack on the young woman matches the Vanishing Triangle cases. However, as with John Crerar, no clear link to the other cases can be established. In 2010, Larry Murphy is released from prison. He was originally sentenced to 15 years in prison for attempted murder and rape, but ultimately only served 2/3 of his sentence. After 10 years in prison, he was released for good behavior. In the years that followed, Larry Murphy remained a person of interest in the cases of Annie McCarrick, JoJo Dullard, and Deidre Jacob. In 2011, a former fellow inmate told the police that Larry Murphy had confessed to him that he had kidnapped and murdered Deidre Jacob. Larry said he had knocked her down, dragged her into his car, and later killed her. Investigators consider Larry's former fellow inmate to be a credible source. However, this statement alone is not enough to charge Larry Murphy with Deidre's murder. There is still no body and no DNA evidence in the case. The same is true for Annie McCarrick and JoJo Dullard. However, a person filmed at Deidre's last known location on the day she disappeared resembles Larry Murphy. In 2019, a witness came forward and stated that at around 2:30 p.m. on July 28, 1998, he saw a car coming toward him on Newbridge Road. This was the day Deidre disappeared. The witness said he saw 2 people in the car. However, he noticed that the person in the passenger seat was not sitting properly, but was rather wedged between the seat and the footwell. It looked as if the person was either laughing heartily or crying heavily. Based on this circumstantial evidence, attempts are being made to charge Larry Murphy in the Deidre Jacob case. However, the request has been rejected by the public prosecutor's office. From a legal perspective, the evidence is simply not strong enough to justify a trial. However, the Irish police continue to consider Larry Murphy a suspect in the Deidre Jacob case, and thus presumably also in the cases of Annie McCarrick and JoJo Dullard. However, it must also be said that Larry Murphy has not been charged with any of the Vanishing Triangle cases. There is some circumstantial evidence that could point to him as a potential perpetrator, but no concrete evidence. In the JoJo Dullard case, the Irish police are said to have another suspect who cannot be charged due to lack of evidence. After his release from prison in 2010, Larry Murphy has not come to the attention of the criminal justice system again. Unfortunately, the mystery surrounding the women from the Vanishing Triangle remains unsolved to this day. The theory that a serial killer may be behind several of the suspected crimes is still being considered. In some cases, a connection seems more likely than in others. In particular, the cases of Annie McCarrick, JoJo Dullard, and Deidre Jacob have been linked in recent years. In these 3 cases, the investigation seems to be still quite active today. The latest updates in the 3 missing cases are relatively recent. The situation is different in the cases of Fiona Sinnert, Fiona Pender, and Kiara Breen. These are the 3 cases in which there have been individual suspects. It therefore seems less likely that they are connected to Annie, JoJo, and Deidre. However, this cannot be completely ruled out because there is simply a lack of evidence. The Phyllis Murphy case could only be solved thanks to DNA samples that had been stored at the time, and these samples could only be secured because there was a body in Phyllis's case. Unfortunately, there is still no trace of the other women I told you about in this video. Neither their bodies nor any personal belongings or clothing have ever been found. No one can therefore prove that a serial killer was at work in the so-called Vanishing Triangle. However, this theory cannot be disproved either. I sincerely hope that something will come to light in these missing persons cases. If the remains of just one or more of the missing women were found, many questions could possibly be answered. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like or comment. Just a few clicks and keystrokes will help Insolito enormously. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, that would be great too. Thank you in advance, and thank you for watching. I wish you a good morning, afternoon, or evening, depending on when you're watching this video, and hope to see you again in the next video. Until then, bye everyone.